in many cases, when you compare differences between two different schools of thought, you often find that when you go towards the extremes, when you often go towards the fringes, they tend to inevitably end up agreeing on certain fundamental issues that affect the way that they see the world. In many cases, they agree on certain fundamental principles, but the conclusion that they derive from them is entirely different. And when you get to the center, there's a bit of ambiguity about how different exactly these two strands of thought are, and if they really are that different at all. For example, when it comes to politics, there's the idea of the political horseshoe theory, where the further you get from the center, the fundamental ideas and principles that are contained within these schools of thought end up merging together or becoming very similar in a sense. Or in other words, the fundamental assumptions or fundamental principles of which both of the extremes operate on are very similar. Of course, you get sort of further away as you are moderate, and the closer you get to the center, the more similar it becomes again. And this is also an idea, I believe, that can be applied in certain theological disputes. I would, of course, term this the theological horseshoe theory. Of course, the spectrum or the schools of thought that we may employ in relation to one another in this regard are going to be rather arbitrary. So do take the examples I'm going to give with a grain of salt. The first example I may give is the Ash'ari Athari split on, for example, the way to interpret the divine attributes and the usage of philosophy in matters of creed. If we are to compare the Athari school and the Ash'ari school in this regard, if we were to, on the one end, put the Athari school and on another end, the Ash'ari school, what we find is at the center, we could place somebody like al-Bayhaqi from the Ash'ari side and Ibn al-Jawzi from the Athari side. And we find that their ways of thinking are in fact very similar, because al-Bayhaqi emphasizes a more scriptural based approach. In his book Al-Asma wa-Sifat, he collects and investigates the various verses of the Quran and various prophetic traditions on the divine attributes. He then explains them according to the Ash'ari method, but this is very similar, of course, to the way the Hanbalis investigate this issue, where they will collect the various narrations and verses on the divine attributes, and they will base their assumptions on that. Ibn al-Jawzi, similarly, although he is operating within the Hanbali or Athari framework, he does employ certain concepts, or he does employ certain terminology or certain methods which would actually be more in line with the Ash'ari school than the sort of mainstream Athari school. And so in that sense, Ibn al-Jawzi is quite close to the Ash'aris, and al-Bayhaqi is quite close to this more traditionalist approach of compiling scripture. And so in the center, these two are really similar. As you get further away though, towards the extremes, let's say, of the Ash'ari and the Athari school, and this is of course a very relative scheme that I'm putting out there, we could have, for example, somebody like Al-Razi on one end and Ibn Taymiyyah on the other end. Of course, Ibn Taymiyyah very heavily criticizes Al-Razi, and Al-Razi very heavily criticizes things like anthropomorphism or likening God to the creation. But interestingly enough, the further away we get from the center towards the extremes, quote unquote, let's say, as a more relativistic spectrum that we've created or assumed, you realize that both Ibn Taymiyyah and Al-Razi have some very key similarities. They both engage very heavily in philosophy. Yes, Ibn Taymiyyah engages very heavily in philosophy. And in fact, Ibn Taymiyyah is probably the one individual who really introduces a lot of this philosophical discussions and dialogues and jargon within the broader Athari school and the Athari theology. And so Al-Razi employs a lot of philosophy and sort of this rational theology as well. Ibn Taymiyyah is also employing it. And in that way, they are actually quite similar then. Also, it's quite funny to know they both are influenced by, ancient Greek philosophers, of course, the Ash'ari school. All the Kalam sects, all the sects that engage in rational theology, borrow from the ancient Greek philosophical tradition. This is well known. But Ibn Taymiyyah is also very heavily influenced by these philosophical traditions as well. In particular, he's influenced by Abu al-Barakat al-Baghdadi, who was a famous Baghdadi physician who had studied the works of the ancient Greeks. In fact, Ibn Taymiyyah calls Abu al-Barakat al-Baghdadi an imam, a leader in philosophy. That's how far Ibn Taymiyyah goes. And Al-Razi, on the other hand, calls somebody like Aflatun, Plato, an imam in philosophy. In that sense, they are very similar as well. And one more interesting similarity is that they both have, towards the end of their lives, a revival sort of, or a rectification, where they both adopt a more moderate position towards the end of their life. Al-Razi, famously in his self-poems he wrote, decried the fact that, the Quran, or sort of scripture, was the best way to gain certainty about knowledge of God, and that reason could not fulfill that role of providing the full knowledge of the divine essence and his attributes. That could only be achieved through scripture. And Ibn Taymiyyah, in his last sort of days, he didn't necessarily retract his opinions, but he came to the conclusion that all of the Muslims who face the Qibla, who face the direction of prayer, who pray 5 times a day, who carry out the basic rituals and believe in the basics of the faith, they are Muslims and they are not to be excommunicated. In principle, although Ibn Taymiyyah is a staunch defender of the Athari creed, and he opposes philosophy and rational theology in principle, he in fact engages with philosophy and rational theology, the Kalam tradition, far more than most Ash'aris would. And of course, Al-Razi is an outright staunch Ash'ari. He's engaging in philosophy and rationality constantly. And so these two extremes, you could say, quote unquote, are actually much similar in some basic methods that they use, in some basic assumptions they both have, in the way that they approach certain matters. And it's funny then that really it kind of horseshoes back in that they both are engaging with the Kalam tradition, the rational theological tradition, and they're both engaging with the philosophical traditions. Another example that one can give of this kind of theological horseshoe theory is if we were to discuss the issue of the speech of God. Is the speech of God created or not? You could, if we are talking about the broader Sunni tradition, we can have the Atharis or the Hanbalis on one side, we can have the Ash'aris and the Maturidis in the middle, and we can have the Mu'tazila on the other extreme. Now, interestingly enough, the Atharis and the Mu'tazila, although they are on two ends of the extreme in regards to the speech of God, because one of them says that it is uncreated, and whoever denies that it's uncreated is a disbeliever. And on the other hand, the Mu'tazila are saying, well, the speech of God is created. God wills this kind of speech into being. But they both have some very key similarities. Both of them assume fundamentally that the speech of God is expressed through sounds and letters, and that, in other words, it's expressed through a kind of medium, or a way in which the creation can understand it. And of course, this comes in the forms of sounds and letters and the composition, let's say, of the divine speech. So for example, when it comes to the Quran, is conveyed through sounds and letters, and through sounds and letters and composition. But then the difference that arises between the two is that the Mu'tazila are going to say, well, because it's composed of sounds and letters, therefore it's created, because it's composed of sort of aspects of speech which are part of the creation, right? They say that sounds and letters are created, so the divine speech has to be created. Therefore, God wills divine speech into creation, into being, but it is not eternal. The Hanabila, the Hanbalis, the Atharis, on the other hand, say, even though the divine speech consists of sounds and letters, it is still eternal, it is still uncreated. And the manner in which it is eternal and uncreated is known best by God, but we cannot understand it, our minds cannot comprehend it, and it's not the duty of the intellect to delve into it. Hence, they operate off of these very basic assumptions that, the speech of God consists of sounds and letters, but the Mu'tazila on one extreme uses this to arrive at the result that that it is created, that it is originated by God. And on the other hand, the Hanbalis say that despite the fact that it is consisting of sounds and letters, it's still uncreated and eternal. Hence, they operate on some very similar assumptions about the divine speech, but using these assumptions, they arrive at completely different end results. And interestingly enough, Mullah Ali Qari, the famous Hanafi scholar and theologian, he operates within the broader sort of traditional Ash'ari Maturidi tradition. He mentions in his commentary of Al-Fiqh al-Akbar, the Mu'tazila make the argument against the Ash'aris that the divine speech consists of sounds and letters, right? That speech consists of sounds and letters, and this is necessarily an attribute of the creation. In response, Mullah Ali Qari writes that this is an argument against the Hanbalis, because the Hanbalis agree that the divine speech consists of sounds and letters, but it is not an argument against the Ash'aris and the Maturidis. Because you see, the Ash'aris and Maturidis in this discussion act as a kind of middle ground, centrist position, so to speak, where they say that the divine speech manifests itself through mediums, so to say sounds and letters or composition, but in essence it is uncreated and it is not conveyed through sounds and letters. This is the nafsi lafzi distinction that they use, the Ash'aris and the Maturidis, that the divine speech in and of itself is pre-eternal. It does not consist of sound or letters, but what is manifested, meaning in the form of the Quran, the manifestation of sounds and letters that conveys the meanings of the pre-eternal speech, is originated and created. Hence, the Atharis and the Mu'tazila, although on two ends of the extreme, have very similar assumptions about the divine speech, which they use to arrive at different end results, and the Ash'aris and Maturidis operate as a kind of middle ground between them. And hence you can see the kind of theological horseshoe that is occurring here.